They thought it was just another ghost story, a forgotten legend about a cursed forest. But what started as a fun Friday night thrill turned into a nightmare they'd never escape. 5 teenagers entered Wicker's grove, but only 4 made it out. The woods whispered warnings, shadows moved, and something ancient woke up, watching, waiting. What they encountered was more than just a haunting. It was a trap. A place that doesn't let you leave whole. Stay with me as we journey into the dark heart of Wicker's grove. But be warned, some things are better left untouched. The story starts with a group of 5 teenagers, Ethan, Megan, Rachel, Tyler, and Jake, driving up to Wicker's grove, a thick, shadowy forest just outside their small town. The forest had a reputation. People said it was haunted, cursed even. Strange things happened in those woods, things no one could explain. But like most teenagers, they didn't believe it. They were thrill seekers, looking for something to do on a dull Friday night. The trees seemed to swallow up the last bit of daylight as they hiked deeper into the forest. The air was cooler here, unnaturally so, and the deeper they went, the quieter the world became. No birds, no insects, just the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. It felt wrong, but no one said anything. Ethan led the way, his flashlight barely cutting through the thick darkness. They had heard about an old, abandoned cabin deep in the woods, the place where all the ghost stories started. That was their destination. The deeper they ventured, the more twisted and gnarled the trees became, their branches almost resembling the arms of old men, reaching out to pull them into the darkness. The path was narrow and uneven, but Ethan urged them forward, confident he knew the way. After what felt like hours, they finally spotted the cabin. It stood in a small clearing, its wooden frame sagging, overgrown with vines and moss. The windows were broken, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The air around it was thick, heavy, and cold, much colder than it should have been for late October. The group hesitated at the edge of the clearing, something about the place giving them a deep, unsettling feeling. But Ethan, determined to prove the stories wrong, stepped forward. The others reluctantly followed, their nerves now on edge. As they crossed the threshold, the forest behind them seemed to shift, as if it had closed in, sealing them inside the clearing. Inside the cabin, the air was damp, and the walls seemed to hum with an energy none of them could explain. There was graffiti on the walls, but old, faded. A rotting wooden table stood in the center of the room, and in the far corner, an old staircase led up to a loft. They split up, cautiously exploring the small, decaying building. Megan stayed near the door, her heart pounding in her chest, while Rachel and Tyler checked out the loft. Jake wandered toward the back, flashlight in hand, scanning the dark corners. Ethan, as always, acted like nothing was wrong, laughing it off and joking, though his voice echoed too loudly in the eerie silence. That's when things started to change. A faint, low whispering filled the room. It was so soft at first, they thought it was just the wind passing through the cracks in the walls. But the whispering grew louder, more distinct, as if a conversation was taking place just out of reach. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the temperature plummeted. Jake was the first to hear it clearly, his name. He turned quickly, shining his flashlight into the dark corners, but there was nothing. Yet the voice had been unmistakable, calling him from somewhere just out of sight. His skin prickled as he stepped backward, feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched. Up in the loft, Rachel felt it too. A chill crept up her spine, and as she turned to Tyler, she saw his face had gone pale. He was staring at the far wall, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. When she followed his gaze, her breath caught in her throat. Carved into the wood, just above their heads, were deep, fresh scratches. The kind that didn't come from animals or weather, but something far more deliberate. It was as if something had been marking its presence, leaving a warning. Downstairs, the whispering became more frantic, rising to a low murmur that filled every corner of the room. The floorboards creaked under invisible footsteps, and the shadows seemed to move on their own, stretching unnaturally long across the walls. Megan, standing frozen by the door, felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The air behind her shifted, and she could feel something, someone, standing right behind her. She didn't dare turn around, her breath quickening, her heart pounding in her ears. But she knew it was there. In the loft, Tyler suddenly grabbed Rachel's arm, his eyes wide with panic. He pointed to the window, and when she looked, her blood ran cold. Outside, just beyond the glass, stood a figure. It was barely visible in the dark, but its outline was unmistakable, tall, with unnaturally long limbs and a face that was just wrong. Its eyes were black voids, staring straight at them. Ethan, still downstairs, had noticed the shift too. His bravado faded as the cabin seemed to close in on them, the shadows growing darker, heavier, pressing in from every side. He called for Jake, but there was no answer. When he turned, Jake was gone. His flashlight lay on the floor, still on, pointing toward the open doorway that led into the woods. Panic set in. They rushed to find him, their voices now frantic, but the forest outside was an endless sea of black. The trees loomed larger, the path they came in on seemed to disappear. Jake was gone. No trace, no sound, just gone. The whispering returned, louder this time, filling the air around them, coming from everywhere at once. It was no longer soft, no longer distant. The voices were all around them, angry, insistent, as if the forest itself was alive, and it wanted them to know they weren't welcome. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream tore through the night. Jake's voice, somewhere deep in the woods. But the scream cut off too quickly, as if it had been swallowed by the forest itself. The others stood frozen for a moment, fear gripping them like icy hands. Ethan, for the first time, didn't know what to do. He stared into the blackness where Jake's scream had come from, knowing that going after him meant stepping into the unknown, but staying meant facing whatever was inside that cabin. Without a word, they ran. Not toward Jake, but back toward where they thought the path was, back to the truck. The trees seemed closer now, their twisted branches reaching out like claws, blocking their escape. Every step they took felt wrong, like the ground beneath them was shifting, pulling them deeper into the woods. Megan tripped, her ankle twisting as she fell hard onto the cold, damp earth. Ethan pulled her up, but as he did, they both saw movement in the shadows, figures darting between the trees. They weren't alone anymore. Whatever had taken Jake was following them now, watching, waiting. Rachel, in full panic, screamed for help, but the forest swallowed her cries. The whispering returned, louder, deafening, surrounding them in a wave of voices. They couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. They weren't supposed to be here. Tyler grabbed Rachel's arm, pulling her forward, desperate to reach the truck. The forest seemed endless, the path that had been so clear now lost to them. Ethan's flashlight flickered, then died, plunging them into near total darkness. They stumbled blindly, hearing the heavy footsteps of something behind them, getting closer. Finally, through the trees, they saw the faint glimmer of their truck's headlights. Salvation. They sprinted the last few yards, practically throwing themselves into the truck, slamming the doors behind them. Ethan fumbled for the keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The engine roared to life, and they sped down the dirt road, leaving the cursed forest behind them. But even as they drove, the whispering didn't stop. It followed them, a faint murmur in the back of their minds, a reminder that something had been left behind. Jake was gone, taken by the forest, and no one would ever find him. The figures they'd seen, the voices they'd heard, they were still out there, waiting for the next group of fools to wander in. As the truck's headlights cut through the night, Rachel glanced into the rearview mirror, her face pale and tear-streaked. For just a moment, she thought she saw a shadow sitting in the backseat, watching them with eyes as dark as the forest itself. And then it was gone. They never spoke of what happened in Wicker's Grove again, but the forest remained. Its trees standing tall, its secrets buried deep, always whispering, waiting for the next group to wander too far into its grasp.